before we get to this week's news, I want to highlight what you called obsolete of products in a 2013 article that I had never read before. These are a cousin of disruptive products, and you gave some examples from tech history. The typewriter and word processor were obsoleted by the PC. Typesetting was obsoleted by the Mac and desktop publishing. The newspaper was obsoleted by the internet. The CD player was obsoleted by the iPod. The iPod was famously obsoleted by the iPhone. You also noted that in addition to the iPod, the iPhone obsoleted the point and shoot camera, handheld video games, watches, calculators, maps, and many, many more. You resurfaced that discussion in an article about Android and Google. Generally speaking, though, how does that discussion relate to where we are now in the smartphone market? Are we waiting for an obsolete successor to the iPhone?
No, I think quite the opposite. The iPhone, the Android, smartphones in general seem more entrenched than ever. There is a bit of etymological history to this, by the way. I mean, the context here is, and I sort of mentioned in my article, this was like it's hard, again, like I said, it's hard to explain to people today, but the by far dominant conventional wisdom is that the iPhone was screwed. Like it was like Apple was going to lose developers, they're going to lose market share because they weren't modulars, it'd be Windows versus Mac all over again, blah 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 blah. And so I wrote that article, what Clayton Christensen got wrong, to say why the disruptive paradigm did not apply to the iPhone. This article, obsolete of, was part 2, which is explaining, well, then why is the iPhone a success? Like this is sort of like peak Clay Christensen era. And I mean, he wrote
don't blah 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 it though. Why did people think the iPhone was going to be screwed? Just for anybody who's not familiar with that history.
The popular conception is that the Mac invented the PC and then they lost it to Windows, because Windows was this modular architecture where Microsoft just made the operating system. They had all the OEMs competing to build the best computers that drove more innovation and lower costs and higher performance. And then the Mac sort of couldn't keep up.
So history was going to repeat itself in the smartphone.
This is like literally like a chapter in Christensen's book. The problem is it's wrong. I mean, it's just like factually wrong. Specifically the first real meaningful, there was lots of PCs like the Commodore, the Amiga, like all these sorts of things that were out there. The real PC though was the IBM PC, which was famously made because there were all these new PCs that were coming out, like the Commodore or the Apple II, and people wanted them for work, and people were bringing in themselves. Like people used to like bring in iPhones back in the day, and it's like, look, companies were going to IBM, the dominant computer player, saying we need these small computers. They're really useful. IBM had no interest in these small computers because they sold big mainframes that had much higher prices, much higher margins. Sort of a disruptive story here. They arguably sort of took the Christensen advice before it existed, which is spin up another team outside the company. So they spun up a team, IBM's in New York. They spun up a team, I think it was Boca Raton, Florida. And their task was to get a PC to market as soon as possible. And so to do that, instead of using IBM stuff, what they said is, we're going to make the BIOS chip. The BIOS is the BIOS is sort of the what does BIOS mean? It means basic input output system. That's basically what runs when you turn on the computer, and it loads the actual operating system. Like there's a real complexity in like how do you actually get a computer started. And so IBM's like, we're going to make that part, because without that, the whole thing won't work. Everything else we're going to outsource. And so they went and got the Intel chip. I believe it was the 8080 from Intel. And then they heard about these guys up in Seattle, Washington, that claimed to have an operating system for them. The great irony is that Bill Gates, Bill Gates and who is the late Portland owner?
Paul Allen.
Paul Allen, thank you. I knew the reference to get you to help me out there.
That's right.
I don't think they actually had an operating system. Like they acquired it from like another company, but they were like, they knew the opportunity was there. And so that operating system became Disk Operating System, DOS. And so the operating system came from Microsoft, the chip came from Intel, but IBM held the BIOS.
Necessity became the mother of strategic invention, essentially.
Right. Well, funny. Well, I mean, the great irony is how this all played out, which is, so this is a big success. Everyone was right. They wanted this PC. So IBM starts selling a ton of them. The problem is that the most important layer of that was actually the chip and the operating system, particularly the operating system, for all the reasons we've talked about. Operating systems matter because they make APIs for developers to make programs. You get programs made for a particular operating system. The users go there for the programs. You have users that attracts developers. It's a virtuous cycle, and you become sort of a dominant player. That's exactly what happened. In the meantime, a company called Compaq in Texas reverse engineered IBM's BIOS. And so what happened was now they could make their own PC. And why could they do it? Because, one of the things that Bill Gates insisted on is that IBM did not have an exclusive license to DOS. Microsoft retained the rights. And so Compaq comes along and says, hey, we have our own PC. We reverse engineered IBM's BIOS. Microsoft's like, happy to sell to you. There we go. And that they were sort of off to the races where they had this ecosystem of suppliers for them. All this happened before the Mac existed. And so DOS becomes the dominant operating system. The Mac comes along, and the Mac, to its credit, gets an incredible amount of developer support because it was so awesome, but it was always and also ran way behind, like 3 or 4 years behind, and from a corporate perspective, way behind because it wasn't sold by IBM, right? Like it was a different sort of beast. And so when Windows came out later, which famously sort of mimicked the look and feel of the Mac, it was just a shell on top of DOS. In fact, a lot of people for many, many years would invoke the command to drop into DOS as soon as they started the computer because they hated Windows. And even today, there's a lot of like DOS programs that will run on Windows. Like Windows is Microsoft's famous for their backwards compatibility and all this sorts of thing. And that is why Windows won. Windows won because it was built on DOS. DOS was first. DOS got traction because of IBM. It was dominant before the Mac ever even existed. And so this whole narrative that the Mac had the lead and lost it because they were modular, not integrated, is totally wrong. Now, there is a sliver of truth in that the PC was very modular. It was modular from day one. It had one company making the chip, one company making the operating system, one company making the BIOS. Once that BIOS got reverse engineered, anyone could make a PC. And so there is some degree of truth in the idea that the modular system did win, but the order of operations in which it happened completely defeats the narrative around the iPhone, which came first. The iPhone was first, and it wasn't going to be the case that Android was going to suddenly become drastically better and developers were going to flee the iPhone because the cheaper, better product was Android, and then the iPhone would sort of fall off the map, which is literally what people thought was going to happen.
Interesting. Yes. And so how does this relate to Android and its integration strategy? Because that's what prompted this history lesson this week.
Well, so the big thing is this. So what happened to smartphone? The part 2 of the article was like this sort of obsolescence. I wanted to call it obviation, but technically obsolescence is sort of the right framing. Obviate means like the use is no longer present. Obsolete
I had never heard obsolete used as a verb until reading your article. So congrats on that. Learn something new every day.
Yeah, I remember back in the day, I went back and forth. I liked the word obviation much more than obsoletive. Obsoletive is a better word, I think.
There's no question.
But to obviate means like the use case is no longer necessary. The use case for a camera is still necessary. The use case for a compass is still necessary. The use case for a calculator is still necessary. What happened was the object that did it became obsolete. And it became obsolete because an iPhone could do it, if not better, if a broad definition of better, whereby better means it's already in your pocket. and by the way, it has a big screen and it's like pleasant to use and all these sorts of things that go
wild,
into it.
Man, I mean, I was going to ask whether the iPhone was the most obsolete product of all time when you consider the various categories of products that were rendered obsolete.
And here's the key thing: it continues to be obsolete. It continues to swallow more and more things. I didn't have in here TV. How much video is consumed on an iPhone versus any other device that we have, right? I didn't have on here
these days, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so the sort of like the pullback, the sort of disruptive folks said, their thing was, it actually disrupted the PC. Back in 2013, not really. People still use PCs. Today, more and more, yeah, kind of disrupting the PC, to be honest. Honestly,
Yeah.
it's kind of, or not disrupting, obsoleting, or no, it's disrupting is something that's sort of better. Uh, Obsoleting tablets, right? Like, I mean, some people use them for TV, but any sort of like work, most people just use larger screen sort of iPhones for, by and large. The iPhone, Android, these smartphones are what I call the black hole of consumer electronics, and black holes grow. They don't shrink. Like they just continue to pull in more and more things, more and more capabilities, and there's no reason to expect that to end. It is such a perfect device. It fits in your pocket, and yet it's large enough to get stuff done on. Like, it is really the Goldilocks sort of device. It has the connectivity, it has the battery power, and to the extent we add on things like watches or AirPods or even goggles or glasses, those are those move the trade-off to, they can be really good at one or two things, but they can never be as good at being a general purpose thing sort of as the smartphone. And so my contention is that the smartphone is in as strong and dominant a place as ever, and continues to get even stronger and more dominant.
Well, as is the iPhone, which was your contention at the beginning of the decade when everybody was
Well,
predicting
right. I mean,
their
because
imminent doom.
yeah, they were first, and also like people are buying their own iPhones and they're using it all the time. And to this idea, you can't overshoot on having a good user experience. You can't overshoot on everything sort of working well together. Integration matters way more, I contend, in the consumer market than in the business market. The whole disruptive sort of text was all about business examples. And I put in there, like, look, there's actually lots of examples of much more integrated things in the consumer market. I talk about consoles, like back then, like consoles were integrated, right? Like this,
Mm-hmm.
to a certain extent. I mean, the whole bit basically ever got over indexed on this operating system and everything else sort of bit. Another bit, I pointed this out years ago, but it's underappreciated the extent to which the other dominant players, and I wrote about Samsung, like, I was gonna say 6 or 7, it's actually 8 or 9 years ago, but Huawei it applies to as well, also highly integrated. Now, they're not making the operating system, but like, say Samsung, for example, they make memory chips, they make logic chips, they make displays, like they make huge numbers of aspects of their phones. Their contribution to the total component cost of their devices is actually much higher than Apple. Apple, almost all that stuff is outsourced. Now that doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but there's a lot more integration that happens in general. And I
Right.
think to keep delivering these new use cases, to get better and better, it continues to be an advantage to be really sort of tightly integrated. Now, I talked about this. I did interview Rick Osterloh, the head of sort of like Android and Pixel this week. He made the point that, like, okay, at the super low end of phones, like sub 400, basically completely Android, that does look a lot like PCs. It's a
Mm-hmm.
standard chip with a standard sort of battery and standard memory and standard XYZ, and
Whatever the cheapest components you can find and just sell it to people.
they work, and they're not a great experience, right? There's a reason people don't go buy them. Like, there's this. I look, I greatly respect Professor Christensen, but I think in general, this whole disruptive thing, it got way over applied to too many places and too many use cases. There's this bit about good enough or overshooting that does matter for some particular use cases, but there's some places, and you take something like the phone, where it's the market is basically the entire world. People will pay for quality, and you
Mm-hmm.
can just consistently deliver quality that is worth paying $1,000, $1,500. The new Fold is $1,800. And why would people pay that? Well, they're actually getting a deal. When you think about how often they use those devices, the dollar they pay per minute of use is one of the biggest bargains in the world.
Well,